I want to welcome Dr. Fischhoff to give the lecture, Give Science a Chance, Communications Under Conditions of Uncertainty. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Well, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to what you have to say, to your comments. I'm going to talk about the science of communicating science. So if the science of communicating science is any good, then communicating this science should be. I should do a clear job of communicating it. So, right. It's about as self-referential as you could get. So the decisions that we make affect the environment, what energy sources we use, where we invest our money in terms of the practices that companies have, what lifestyles you have, how far you live from work and your family in terms of your carbon footprint of your travel. Also, what we decide also depends on the environment. Will your trees, fish, crops be savaged by bugs or invasive bugs or diseases? Will the tourists keep coming in places that are dependent on it? Can your children get well if you live in a particular place? Can you eat this, drink that milk, water, coffee? And if not, what can you drink? So, in order to make these decisions, people, that's us, need trusted, comprehensible information about the risks and benefits of the actions that they might take. And what they, which is to say we, get is often something less. So I'm going to show a bunch of examples of bad communications. I decided to pick almost all non-environmental examples because I feel like some of our friends could do a better job, but I don't want to pick a fight with my friends, and I don't want to criticize because the communication. I'm going to show you what I think are bad communications, and then some good ones. And maybe with the exception of the first one, we're all done with good intent. So here's a communication about the science associated with pharmaceuticals. You could pick one of these up at the equivalent you could pick up. It's apparently a fantastic distribution system that almost every prescription comes with one of these useless documents. They're all on one page because there are pharmacies that still have dot matrix printers. And but anyway, so. Lots of information, doesn't tell you what you want. And in fact, if you read it all, it wouldn't tell you in a quantitative term, what the risks and benefits are, along with the quality of the information. Too much information doesn't do the job. Here's done by some friends at Dartmouth, Lisa Schwartz and Steve Woloshin, who had a wonderful article in the Tuesday's Times Health section on the value of medical screening. They're really in the physicians community. They're among the best science-based communicators. So they found this had an article in the New England Journal about 10 years ago in which they said, well, we had a breast cancer stamp that has a statement of support, fund the fight, find the cure. The only thing that was controversial about it was that the stamps were 32 cents at that time. It had an 8-cent surcharge, and apparently the philatelists hate that. A stamp is a stamp. You want to contribute money, contribute money. And then they found that there was then they wondered, there was a prostate cancer stamp that came along afterwards. It was a regular stamp, but it had advice on it, which was annual checkups and tests, and those you probably know that this is not uncontroversial advice, whether or not even at that time, the most recent guidance which they were involved in suggests that actually the value of prostate cancer screening may be slightly negative. So they wanted. There's a lovely article trying to figure out why how we got what they called the world's most widely licked medical advice. And so there, it's a simple message, but it doesn't give you all the information that you need in order to evaluate it properly. I was, in some sense, maybe still am, a member of the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Advisory Committee. It hasn't met in a couple of years, which may say something. And And so in some sense, I'm kind of responsible for this because I was the one social science providing advice on it. And so if you went to ready.gov until about 3 months ago, this has now been withdrawn. You found this advice for what to do in the case of a nuclear attack. Some of us my age and older will recognize the fallout shelters on the side and imagine that there's still some of those visible. The one in the middle I like because it assumes that you're very fleet of foot. And somehow that the shockwaves will go around the corner or will not follow you. And on the right, and then there's this kind of new agey type language. Consider if you can get out of the area, if you would be better to go inside a building and follow your plan to shelter in place. You could also find, actually I didn't check whether this was still there, but if you used the old ready.gov, it's just been redesigned. If you went to important notices, you found this. So you really can't make this up. So here, this was from early last year. So it took us, we improvised the color-coded warning system. It took us 10 years to get rid of it. 2 days later, the Russians adopted. Maybe they got a good deal, with a yard sale for. So here's from another source. So this is from the National Academy of Sciences, where the Academy wanted to help people understand these risks. So you have radio. There was a series of 4, and I was somewhat involved in it. And the academicians who were involved in trying to provide this information thought that it was very important, so they devoted, a third of the first page to giving you like a textbook lesson on the different kinds of ionizing radiation, as though were there a dirty bomb, you would reason from first principles whether what to do, and then. I was at a meeting on severe storms a couple of months ago. The day of the meeting, this showed up this showed up that Verizon sent out this message saying, Verizon apologizes after sending mass text warning of threat to life in New Jersey without saying it was a test. So you could ask whether this is good information, but it is. So something is going wrong here. I mean, in all these cases, except maybe the first, there was an intent to give good information. They're often good production values. Somebody is trying and not succeeding. When we have poor communications, where they undermine in the environmental domain, they undermine environmental decision making by missing opportunities to help people make sound choices, to learn about people's concerns, communication coming from the other direction, to design better options for people, and to get full value from our science. Poor communications also undermine public trust, civil society, and our social contract by suggesting to the public that the people who are providing this information are indifferent, as they don't care enough to get it right. They're deaf. They can't hear what the public concerns are, and we're all the public except for very narrow areas in which we're the experts. Or so it could even be hostile to public concern. They just don't want to know. They're just checking off a box that obligates them to do some kind of communication. So why are so many well-meaning communications so poor? And to organize this talk, I thought of a number of reasons. So first, maybe the simplest way is to think, well, scientists are just like everybody else. And the things that we find generally to be true about individual psychology will also be true about scientists when they're functioning in this role, which is outside of their normal expertise. So scientists, like everybody else, tend to have faulty intuitions about others. So if you've had an intro psych course, or a particular intro social course any time in recent years, you'll see that much of the text has to do with much of the science has to do with ways in which we fail to understand other people or fail to understand how well we're communicating. So there are a bunch of effects. They're all, in some ways, kind of heavily overlap. There's the common knowledge effect, which is that you assume that everybody else knows what you know because it's second nature to you, and then you fail to give people pieces of to fill in to give people information that they need, and you leave them kind of reading between the lines of your communication because you haven't told them things that they need to know. The false consensus effect is the situation we exaggerate the extent to which other people agree with us and are shocked when they view the world differently and fail to create those bridges that would see whether we're just miscommunicating or we have legitimate difference. There are myths that people have. So there's a widespread myth that the public will panic if you had a crisis situation like a dirty bomb. And the sociologists who study this find that panics, in the sense of people running in the street, crazed, abandoning their normal social mores, are actually very rare. They occur in nightclub fires, if you think of an archetype, closed situation where people can't really see what to do, and there's really sort of nothing that you could do that right. Even the archetypal picture of people running, in the streets, the streets of New York right after the attacks on September 11th, are people evacuating, an incredibly remarkable evacuation. I was at a human factors meeting a few weeks afterwards, and there was somebody who's an expert in egress. It's a living, I guess, Well, which is how to get people out of a building. And he said their preliminary calculations had been that the evacuation from the World Trade Center had exceeded the theoretical limit. They model people's movement as a kind of fluid dynamics problems. There's a certain kind of viscosity and friction between people, and people were less viscous, under these horrible situations than they would have theoretically predicted. But there are people who routinely argue that the public will panic, and as a result, the public can't be trusted and just let us run things. So we have these, that's why you need social scientists to do the research in part, but we have these raw intuitions that are wrong about other people. Scientists have them too. Second thing is that scientists, like everybody else, stay in their own world. So there are many organizations many bodies that have made have said what the nature of the interrelationship between the public and experts should be around managing risk. There's our academy has done many things. The Royal Society had really a nice issue on this about 6 months ago. There was a presidential congressional commission on risk, and this is one I like. I like their picture. It's from the quasi-governmental Canadian Standards Association. And this is their vision of how we should manage risk, and it's functionally equivalent to those you'd find in other places. It has, in the middle, kind of a standard systems organization. You initiate a project, you do some preliminary analysis, you do some risk estimation, and you see the thing through. The only thing that's unusual here is that, to the Canadians' credit, you probably can't see this, but there's these these arrows between the different stages. So do a reality check, and if it isn't working, go back and do it again. And if you can't get it right, stop. I think we have a can-do attitude here south of the border, and we plunge through. But I guess actually you probably can't see this at all, so that loses it. So anyways, what they have is they have a bar here that says risk communication. That's connected by two-way arrows all the way through. So it says when you start a project, talk to the public. So on the one hand, listen to them, so you find out what really matters to them. You're worried about road traffic, you're worried about property values, you're worried about toxic. Find out what they're concerned about, so you do the analyses that are relevant to people and design the project that's most relevant to them, and then tell them what they're doing, so they're not blindsided by it, that they feel respected and included, and maintain that all the way through. So this is the standard by which to which any major development should be. Any development should be, should be held. And if we're not doing that, we're not getting out enough, and we don't get out enough. And scientists are like everybody else. Third thing is that when scientists, like anybody else, think that you've got a people problem, they want a simple solution. So why are people doing that? I had a wonderful Uncle Joe who died recently, and they posted the funeral online, and one of his there was two of his colleagues, a child psychiatrist, and two of his colleagues, and then two of his granddaughters spoke. And for the older people, if you want to have a feeling that the kids are all right, ask me for the Earl, because listening to Martha and Rachel was just wonderful. And Rachel said at some point, she said, whenever I would ask my grandfather, why do people do things, he would say, there's always more than one reason. And so somebody says, how do you explain uncertainty? And wants a one-sentence answer, you serve them the best by not saying anything at all. So, so what are the simple solutions that they get? So there's a kind of meme out there now, much of it generated on the basis of really good research by colleagues of mine, sometimes friends of mine, who've produced a series of books with some covers here. If you go to Amazon on one, you'll find I wasn't paid for that placement. Then they do make it really easy to copy their covers. So if you want to use something in a talk, so there's Don Ariely's Predictably Irrational, this book by Nudge by Dick Thaler and Cass Sunstein, who says people can't have difficulty making decisions about this. Just push them in a direction that you consider to be right that they would consider to be right to them if they could. If they would pay attention and could understand the issue. You're not so smart. Mistakes were made. Predictable surprises. In the books written by academics, the science is really sound, but the meme that comes across is one that people are just not to be trusted. That's the message that comes across. The best of these books, and the one that, and often they're written quite compassionately, but the message that comes across is one that people really can't understand complicated situations. This is my doctoral advisor, Donnie Kahneman. It's on the New York Times bestsellers. This is the most thoughtful and reflective book. I think that Donnie has written it right on just kind of the glass half empty and the glass half full, but the story that people are taking away is the simplistic one, because you want to know, just tell me something about people so that I can do it. When people take something away from people, what they take away often is a message that feeds their preconceptions. So you could imagine that the public is either hyper-rational or irrational. And you could have, I'm not certain what these labels mean nowadays, but so they're in quotation marks. But there are people who want popular democracy and would like to find evidence suggests a hypercritical public. There's people who would dismantle our regulatory environment and say markets will do everything, and they too want. So these are, people work back from the end to find the evidence that sorts. We all do it. So. And scientists are when they start thinking about behavior in an unsystematic way, then they're prone to this as well. And why do we do it? Because all of these simple solutions have a grain of truth. So here's a set of simple principles of judgment that I think most people in the field would agree with. So one is that we're very good at people are good at tracking what they see, but not at detecting sample bias. So so it's as though we have an automatic counter for the frequency which we've seen accidents or a kind of bird or sales at a particular product. The disagreement among the scientists is whether we have tokens for each of those individual sightings, and then we add them up when somebody says, how often does that go on sale, or whether we have a detergent on sale icon, and it gets strengthened each time we see it. So you can imagine the memory being organized. But there's no disagreement that people pick up frequency even when they're not being asked for it. But we don't often ask whether appearances are deceiving, and when we do, it's tricky to adjust for what we see to what's actually there. That was the point of the trailer from the movie that you just show. If the evidence isn't there, you can think about what evidence might be hidden or might be misinterpreted or might not be viewed as newsworthy. But that's not the same thing as seeing things as actually seeing the evidence. So we have all of these principles, but none of which gives us the whole picture. These are principles of what we call judgment, which is assessing the state of the world. We have other principles of choice, which is, okay, you see what you can get. What do you want? So one of the principles is that both psychologists and economists would agree on this, that people consider the return on their investment in making decisions. So you say, gee, people don't pay any attention. They must be irrational. Well, not if they don't think it's going to be worth their while. If they think that the situation is out of their control, why gather the evidence? If I think that they're not doing a decent job of conveying the information to me, so why should I invest in reading that patient package insert? I'm not going to find what I want anyway. So I'm making a rational decision from a value of information sense, but it's not one that's. But it's easy to criticize me if you're just looking at how much time that I'm spending on it. So we have all these principles. Each of them has a grain of truth that in a sense, decision-making follows simple principles. However, the set of principles is large. This was just a sample of things that we know. The contextual triggers are subtle. So sometimes people rely on how often they've counted things, and sometimes people say, let me see if I can imagine that happening in the future. So that will be related to how often I did it. So there's different ways that we can assess a probability. So who says it? What's the balance of arguments here? So the simple principle that proves relevant is subtle, and their interactions are complex. All these things are going on. It's hard to predict what's going to happen. I mean, think of people who are trying to market commercial products. They know all of these principles, and they don't imagine that they can predict what kind of advertising would work without collecting some kind of evidence. And yet we produce communications which the planet or your patient's health depend without doing the due diligence. So you need research for each communication. It needn't be expensive research, but you need some evidence to see how well you're doing. And then scientists, we just don't. If you don't collect the evidence, you don't get very much feedback. So here's a study that we did. I think this may be the only evidence that I have actual data in the talk. So I had a friend, a high school friend named Larry Brilliant, who organized a meeting just on the eve of the avian flu, what might have been an avian flu pandemic. And Larry suspected that we would not mobilize well to deal with it. And this was, I think it was a reasonable supposition. It was just. And he got together 20 or so leading public health experts, 20 or so leading technology experts, of people who would be in a position to keep the communications going were society to grind to a halt because of a massive pandemic. And in preparation for the meeting, Wendy Brun de Bruin and Denise Caruso and I and Larry put together a survey asking people to give precise predictions of different things happening. So the first question in the survey was, what's the probability that H5N1 will become an efficient human-to-human transmitter? And to find that even more precisely, capable of being propagated through at least 2 epidemiological generations of affected humans sometime during the next 3 years. Give us a probability. So here's the probabilities that people gave. The black ones are the public health experts. If you look at this histogram, the public health experts, most of them thought it had a small probability. In another, well, small in a sense, around 10%. On another question, they thought that the case fatality rate was going to be about 15%. Like 15% of people who got it died. So 10% chance of 15%, you could get worked up about that. And then there was a minority that thought that it had a higher probability of transmission. These, the other experts, who are some of the smartest people, and most accomplished people in the country, we had several name brands in the audience, which I'm not allowed to name. Almost all thought it was a pretty high probability. So somehow or other, if you remember the saturation coverage that we had at that time, nobody gave a probability. And the audience kind of read the noise and thought, they think this is going to happen. When they thought, about a 10% chance, and we ought to mobilize for that. So once this was over, you could think, what was that about? Then we had H1N1, and if you thought, there's a lot of noise, and, and both of those viruses have so far proven relatively merciful, compared to what we thought had been relatively merciful. Certainly were deaths, and you would think, they're alarming us needlessly. So this would not be a hard message to communicate. 10% chance of this spreading from person to person, that's not hard to understand. But nobody bothered to give us the information that you really needed in order to do this. So scientists are like everybody else, but they could do better with a little bit of help. So there are two kinds of help that you need. You need analytical help, which is to figure out what are the few things that people most need to know in order to make the decisions that they're facing. And the only way for that, you need to know what matters to people and what the science is. And then you need to do empirical research to determine what people already know. So you're not wasting their time telling them things that they already know, unless you need to affirm that for some reason. And then evaluate use this best science we have to come up with a first draft and a second draft and an nth draft of your communication, and then see how well it works. So this part of our research, this is what we do. Talk to the scientists, talk to the people, analyze the data, come up with drafts and then successive drafts, and try to create communications. Here's some of the topics that we've worked on. I'm happy later to talk about any of them, but it's all the same methodologies: analysis and data, deeply informed by the subject matter experts. So here I have a few examples of communications that I kind of like. So this is this is today's weather here, and this is not a bad display you could get. Well, an interesting part of this display is the probability of precipitation, which is 10% here. So it turns out a late friend, a statistician named Alan Murphy, almost single-handedly got the National Weather Service to give probability of precipitation forecasts. And Alan, and there's always been a group of weather forecasters who don't like to give numbers. And it turns out there's a general phenomena that people like to get probabilities, but like to give vague verbal statements. I like to say, it's probably not going to rain tomorrow. But you want to hear, is that 10% or 0% or 30%? It'll affect whether I pour cement or harvest or whatever. The meteorologists are like everybody else. Actually, they're just like, intelligence analysts and clinical reviewers of pharmaceutical evidence. So Alan so I have one paper in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. So one nice part of this field I'm in is that you publish in journals that you've never seen. So I don't have this on our coffee table. So, but I could. Now you can find everything online. And Alan said, well, there had been a master's thesis done by somebody you still hear on the radio now, arguing that people didn't understand probability of precipitation forecasts. And Alan Murphy was convinced that the problem wasn't with probability; the problem was precipitation. Now, what does 10% chance of rain mean? Does that mean 10% of the day, over 10% of the area, 10% of some rain at the weather station? So we did this study showing that people were equally confused whether you had numbers or words. And the answer is, in the United States, it's a hundredth of an inch of rain at the weather station. Not hard to explain to people, but if you don't know what rain means, then 10% chance of it is ambiguous. One of the reasons why we did this study I showed a few minutes ago, we asked this precise question because in our view, you shouldn't be asking people for probabilities unless you're asking for very precise, unless you're asking about an event that's precise enough that in some way you could evaluate against reality. We found in work we've done with adolescents that you can get probabilities from, you can get teens to give probabilities with good validity, cross-sectional validity, predictive validity about things in their lives. Teens can give you useful information if you ask them precise events. So here's a second communication that I really like. This is from, you can't really see this, but the details here, but this is from Lisa Schwartz and Steve Woloshin at Dartmouth. They've been developing for over the last 10 years an alternative to those traditional patient package inserts. And what it is it gives you quantitative information about these different products. He said, oh, this is for a sleeping pill. It says, it'll take me 45 minutes to fall asleep. Well, that's good to know. Not that just it's going to help you, but it's going to do that. It tells you the risks in both probabilities and frequencies. It tells you how good the evidence is in kind of relatively easy to understand terms. There were 788 healthy adults in this sample, so you can say, well, that's a moderate-sized sample. But these were healthy adults. I've got some other issues. Maybe they're not representative of me. At the bottom it said, how long has it been in use? It was improved in 2005. Clinical trial might last a year. You say, well, it's been out for 7 years. That has more chance for people to find long-term effects, drug-drug interactions in larger samples. So, and Steve and Lisa have done studies with representative samples of Americans, sent them these things, and 70% of people can get the information that they need out of something like this. We still have an obligation to the other 30%, but we shouldn't deny the 70% the good information because some people can't understand. Here's a variant on this that you might just think about. So if you go to the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, it will give you risk numbers for very premature infants characterized by their gestational age, birth weight, sex, whether they were single birth or not, and whether the mother had taken corticosteroids, and that. So you can go and get this information. It's less. So you would, if somebody, were thinking about these problems, you couldn't. There's no way you could guess at these numbers before. Whether people can actually process numbers like this all by themselves, I don't know. And then weirdly, they give you the same probabilities twice in complementary form in terms of probability of survival and probability of death, and so on. So these are hard situations that fortunately a relatively small number of people people face. I don't know that this was tested at all, anything like. So it's the same strategy. Give people numbers that they need, but not necessarily done in a way that ensures that people have do they really understand what these terms are? Do they want to be left alone without these numbers? Should these numbers always be given in the context of another human being? So they have no evidence. I don't believe they have any evidence. So this is put that in, kind of unpleasant thing to a topic to put up, to say that you really need to evaluate everything. It's nice that they succeeded with the drug fact box. We don't know that the same strategy works here. So what could you do instead of this? So I'm sure guessing that somebody wrote a reasonable sized check for this. I have Keith Florey, who's a radiation physicist who I've worked with. I said, could we do better in a week with back-of-the-envelope calculations? And so we came up with what we think, this is in the journal Health Physics, so it got, it's published in a respected place. So we came up with what we thought were a simple, memorable set of rules to what to do were there, heaven forbid, a nuclear explosion someplace, where all you really need to know is how far you are away from the blast. And if we just boiled it down as simple as possible, consistent with the evidence. And we also said, well, who do you evacuate? Imagine, this horrific event that happened. I won't go into the details, but it turns out there's a simple trend. Anyways, it turns out this is a relatively straightforward calculation, and it turns out that you would want to evacuate people in the flimsiest housing who are the closest to the blast zone. So he did the calculation. It's probably something that if you planned in advance would lead you to evacuate people, the poorest people who tend to live in the flimsiest housing first. And rather than, it would give you a rule that might work against perhaps the natural tendency for the politically powerful to get themselves treated first, when it would actually be to their benefit. There'd be a greater public health good in evacuating the people who are most at risk, and it might actually be to their advantage to wait longer because they're getting pretty good protection where they are. The third example is a project that we've done, and looking at trying to help young women make sexually decisions about their sexual health. We have an interactive DVD that we tested about 10 years ago and are now in a position to do a replication. So nobody wants to have a sexually transmitted infection, but we found so you talk to the people who know the medicine, they tell you where the risks are. The risks are. You talk to kids, and they typically know quite a bit about HIV/AIDS because it's often taught with really quite good material. There's some holes in what's taught. There's very little taught about all the other sexually transmitted infections. There's a lot of things. It's really kind of complicated. And we said, well, how could you teach this more simply? So we found that most kids, most adults, have some general notion of the difference between viruses and bacteria. Bacteria, you can do antibiotics. Viruses can't. Parasites, there's something else. We don't know what you do with them. So if you did this interactive DVD, you would say, well, what's the disease that you're interested in? For whatever reason you're interested in genital herpes. You look there, and that has the icon for has the appropriate icon, and then if you want to learn about that, then you can go someplace for that, and then it'll tell you the kind of things that you need to know relative to decision making, like, could my partner tell if he has it? So everybody wants to believe that their partner is telling the truth. If it turns out males are asymptomatic, that's important to know. So And so we organized it in, from all the things that doctors could tell you, we found the things that we believed would be most important. But we also found in talking to young women in the formative stages of this, that many of them felt coerced in sexual situations. And I'm not the first people to find this, so we reiterated what it was. We thought that a contribution that we could make was to break down typical intimate interactions. So to say, here are the different here are decision points. So there's a message there. You have a right to say no at any point, and it's not for us we're not judging whether you should stop or go. But if you want to stop, you have a right. And what would you do here? Think a little bit about if you found in this situation, what would you do here? And then the actress will give one example of something that you could do. So in a proper randomized control trial, it turned out to we had less chlamydia infections and reinfections in a very high-risk population. I think 1 in 6 of the young women had chlamydia coming into it. Better reported use of condoms and fewer problems, better condoms, and less reported sex in kids who had this. So this is a non-judgmental program, but it seemed to reduce, if you believe the self-reports, and it's a complicated topic, that it reduced the, we think, you can't tell, but we think that it reduced the amount of coerced sex so that the young women we're better off that way as well. So each of these things has to say what's really important. People need to know the probability of rain. They need to know what to do in an emergency. They need to know how to handle intimate relationships in a way that achieve all of their ends, which are making relationships and living their life, as well as not getting sick or getting taken advantage of. We pulled in whatever we knew we did an analysis. We had experts on the team, and we tested everything again and again before we put it out. So you could say, is this communication good enough? You've done the best you can. Do you have a right to communicate? So here are 3 criteria for the adequacy of communication. So communication is adequate if it has the information that people need for effective decision making, people can access that information, and people can comprehend what they access. So that's a standard I argue that we should put to themselves. So to go a next stage is in our work we've called a materiality standard for the content. You think of this is using material in the legal sense. You could say a communication is adequate if it contains any information that might affect a significant fraction of users' choices. So it's like when you're writing and you say, does my audience really need to know that? Or I'm just saying that because I always say that, or because, I don't know, I like to say that, but I digress. So the same discipline should be here. If people don't need it, don't say it. Don't hide it. So there may be small side effects of a drug. Most people, it won't be important to very many people. So don't hide it because people have a right to know. But highlight the stuff that people need to know, and you're more likely to get people to follow the communication if they feel like they're getting stuff that's useful to them. A proximity standard for the accessibility information. So communication is adequate if it puts most users within X degrees of separation from the needed information, given their normal search patterns. So don't hide things in plain sight. Make it available to people, and not everybody needs to get it directly. There may be, I don't want to know everything. I've got an uncle, or I've got a doctor, or a teacher, or or a religious figure who I go to for that kind of information. But don't make me work too hard for it. And then finally, a comprehensibility standard. So it's adequate if most users can extract enough information to make good choices. So let me conclude in the 3 minutes left with some good things that are happening. I think places where I think communications are getting better. So this is a really nice site run by a friend, Gary Schweitzer, where they're journalists, medical writers who review reports in the press in order to see whether people are doing a good job. And they're hoping, so you can go to their site and see people talking about prostate cancer testing, who's doing the best job, and read just that, and they're hoping that this will bring discipline within their own industry. We don't have anything equivalent on science communication. The Food and Drug Administration has a strategic plan for risk communication, which it's been working through for a number of years. It has a risk communication advisory committee that I chaired for 4 years. FDA is trying really hard to get its act. Not get its act together. It's trying really hard to do a better job of taking advantage of its vast expertise. I have tremendous respect for how hard the people work, but often they work really hard and then they don't have the resources to see the communication through, and FDA realizes, and they're both under the previous commission and the current commission are working hard. They're thinking about working. They've made a commitment to be more explicit about what they believe when they license drugs. My committee produced an evidence-based, communicating risks and benefits, an evidence-based guide that's designed to make it really easy for anybody to communicate, to create scientifically sound communications. The chapters are all short. Each of them ends with a section on how to evaluate your communication for whatever purpose it is with no budget at all. With a teeny budget, and with the budget worse, the stakes riding on somebody knowing what the risks and benefits are of a medical device or a product or potentially contaminated food. And then finally, the National Academy of Sciences has 2 or 3 times a year has an interdisciplinary colloquium. It's called the Sackler Colloquia, and there's one a month from now on the science of science communication that I think will be really good. It's been oversubscribed, but it's going to be webcast if anybody is interested in this. We're having 4 former science advisors: David Pogue, Marshall O'Brien, which we usually have. Dandy Kahneman is speaking. I think it's just going to be great, and I think it'll be really interesting. But I'm also hoping that it'll raise the awareness of the scientific community of doing its science communication more scientifically. And I always end with references. Okay, well, thank you. Questions? Yes.
Thank you. Enjoyed that very much.
Oh, thanks.
I'm a retired physician, and to me, the biggest problem in communication with a patient, let's take a patient in this example, is that you know that a certain treatment, a device that you implant or a medication that you advise, has a bell-shaped curve as a response from a population. But the patient doesn't want to know about all that. He wants to know how he himself is going to respond as one person. And in order to advise him competently, you almost feel like you have to describe the whole bell-shaped curve.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to hear it.
Yeah.
How do you solve that dilemma?
Well, there's a 3,000-word chapter in our little book, which is available free download from online on DoctorPatient Communication. I mean, physicians, caring physicians are in the unique position of being able to tailor their communication to the specific patient. So we know, it is a complicated, there is some research on this. If you're interested, I recommend going to it, which talks about, there's one chapter of DoctorPatient Communication which talks about kind of the shared decision making and how do you get the locus of control, of authority appropriate, and other things about how to summarize technical information for people. So it's a legitimate problem, and then there are people who really do want you to make the decision for them, and particularly if they're. Yeah, well, you obviously know this much better than I do, so yes. I feel your pain.
Hide the fact that you're making the decision.
Yeah. Please.
Dr. Fischhoff, thank you very much. I loved your atomic blast graphic there, and it reminded me.
I had help.
It reminded me of something we have right here in this area, which is the famed evacuation route signs, which I'm sure everyone knows about. And when I first saw them, I thought, what are the chances of having to evacuate the east side of the neighborhood rather than the west side? I think most of us laugh when we see those signs because how do you know which side of the danger you're on? It became evident to me at a certain point that these evacuation routes were put in case of a sort of a coastal issue coming up, either a weather event or something. But there's a chance that something could come from the inland side. And I thought probably somebody figured out that there's a greater than 50% chance of having to evacuate, that it's better to evacuate from the coast towards the inland than evacuating from the inland towards the coast. But in my opinion, that project to put those signs up should have been nipped in the bud, because it's a question of is it a 60% chance that the evacuation should head inland, and because you've obviously been working with the government on this sort of issue, I was wondering if you could perhaps shed some light on how a project like this gets done, that they actually go ahead and put these evacuation route signs up. Yeah.
So I know nothing about these details, but I think my speculation will probably affirm what I'm guessing is your speculation, is that there was actually one group, agency, whatever, that was responsible for the evacuation inland. The evacuation, the threat from the other side, those people weren't even at the table, so one group did it. It reminded me, we were talking, we lived in Eugene, Oregon for a while, and I was a founding father of the Eugene, Oregon Commission on the Rights of Women. And it was really like the best political job I ever had, because you were expected not to show leadership. So you could do too much. So, but at some point, as a risk analyst, we at some point mediated a dispute between the Eugene Fire Department and the police department, one of whom was installing deadbolt locks and the other of whom was taking them out. So that would be my guess. I don't think anybody did the calculus.
Hi, Mike McMahon, May Maritime. In today's media, you see a lot of shock and awe. You touched upon LNG as another subject that you showed up on the slide. And with today, it seems like the most shocking and terrifying event is something that they can sell. So we always hear, like, if we bring an LNG tanker into Boston, for instance, and if someone were to attack it, we'd see a complete demolition of the entire city. Where in reality, some of the science behind that might contradict that idea and say, there's science that proves that this can't really happen. But when you have a news media that's out there saying that this horrible thing can happen and everyone's right behind it, how is a scientist or an engineer with actual data and with information, how are you supposed to convey this to the public, where a majority of the time they're just being bombarded with all this information that is completely contradictory to what you believe or you have evidence to?
So some of these processes are, as you're suggesting, are out of our control. I think that maybe there's two things that the professional community can do. One is not to be caught flat-footed. That is to have well-prepared, tested communication material ready when the topic comes up, so that so that the science, is told in a way. A second thing that the professional community can do is to act in a trustworthy way, so that in the balance their message comes across. We were talking earlier. I had a project class that looked at a few years ago, that looked at the siting of LNG terminals, and what they found was, among the things that the students found, was that the communications were just terrible. They were pro forma. It was contracted out to somebody else. There was, if I remember the number correctly, you needed to tell everybody within 2.5 miles that this was going to happen. And if you were 2.51 miles, then your next door neighbor got warned and you weren't warned. One of the sites was that the students looked at had a long history of issues regarding environmental justice, so the agencies weren't really trusted. So even though these might be new agencies, they can't wash their hands of the burden that was there. So having good tested messages so that you're not surprised by something that's entirely predictable. Somebody's going to ask you, and shame on you if you haven't prepared for it. And then to bend over backwards to act in a trustworthy way, follow something like that Canadian scheme of actively seek people's attention. And we know how to do that. It's just often not done. Yes.
So you mentioned in your presentation the bias that people have for information that pertains to them or that they want to hear. What's the best way to mitigate that? And so you're not preaching to the choir always.
Well, maybe there's two things there. One is people want information that's relevant to their concerns. And the second is people want to hear what they want to hear, and we being included in the people. So maybe it's useful to distinguish. There are situations that people just won't hear, and sometimes that people they can't hear because they don't. There's a piece of the argument that's missing. So. I was talking to Dr. Shaw earlier, and said I was on EPA Scientific Advisory Board, and once a year we had we got educated, and we had a really good series of talks on epigenetic phenomena, and which gave, for me, for the first time, a plausible causal link between endocrine disruptors, between the chemicals that are considered to be endocrine disruptors and the health effects that are attributed to them. So I'd heard the results. They were for people that I trusted, but I didn't really I couldn't really hear it because the science didn't make sense to me. So sometimes that missing link is a bit like in the sexually transmitted thing. I believe he's telling the truth. Oh, he couldn't tell. I mean, that's all right. I may still not want to believe it, but at least I'm capable of understanding it.
I didn't quite hear why you decided not to look at environmental risk, but since Mary is about keeping toxins out of the marine environment, I might move to that to see if we can get a little bit of specific as opposed to theoretical information. Many years ago, I attended a seminar with Peter Montague, who published Rachel's Environment and Health Weekly for a long time.
Yeah.
And his suggestion was that because risk assessment is used very much by the chemical industry to prove what they want to prove, we might be better to look for alternatives assessment. It's a different way of looking at things, and it enables us to find information from sources that we trust as opposed to sources that have a vested interest.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you bother about making those distinctions.
Yeah. So I use non-environmental examples partly because I've worked in these areas and I know the science well, and partly because I just didn't want to criticize people I'm basically sympathetic to. I also didn't, because part of my point is that one needs evidence on what works and what doesn't work. I'm pretty confident those other things don't work. And I've never done anything on marine science. I didn't really have anything that fit. That's why I chose this other strategy deliberately, to make it more theoretic. On Peter Montague's point on risk analysis, so two people whose work I really respect and who take different positions on this. One is Adam Finkel, who's at Penn now and introduced risk analysis or is in charge of risk analysis at OSHA during the Clinton administration. Is one of those people who believes that that you can that in principle, risk analysis can be done in a way that represents the kind of concerns that Peter Montague would say are typically left out. Somebody who's on the other side, who I also respect a great deal, is Mary O'Brien, who's a botanist I know from when we lived in Eugene. She's one of the founders of the Northwest Coalition for Alternatives to Pesticides, and among other things. And she has a really good book. I'm blanking on its name right now, MIT Press 2000, arguing that risk analysis is fundamentally flawed because it encourages us to analyze fixed alternatives. I think she also believes that the rules are rigged in the way it's actually done, but she says that in principle, even if both sides had equal resources to do it, she says it focuses us on proving that something is or is not above some threshold, whereas all that intellectual activity is better invested in trying to create new alternatives. That risk analysis as a technique stifles the kind of innovation that we need. I mean, in addition to how it's used as a political tool for slowing things up. And so Adam would say, if we get the politics right, risk analysis could help us. Mary O'Brien would say, oversimplifying their arguments, but Mary would say, no, we're still losing something if we focus on that direction. I think you find among people who are advocates of various precautionary principles that some of them believe that it's just that you need a completely different alternative. This is our method as opposed to their method, and other people say, no, this is a complement to pick up things that risk analysis can't get.